So welcome back, everyone, to the SWT TV. We're broadcasting live from the back of my sofa this year. I've moved the front room around. So now, for those of you who haven't seen one of our talks before, the format is roughly that James is going to talk about some thrushes for how long, James? About 45 minutes?
About 45 minutes, I think, Michael. Yeah, around about that.
About 45 minutes, and at the end, we'll do a little Q&A session. Now, there should be, at the bottom of your screen, there should be, or top of your screen, or over there somewhere, depends on how you're sitting, I guess, there should be a little Q&A icon. And if you click on that, you can actually, you can type in a question, and I'll ask James some questions at the end. I've got my little sheet here, questions for James. There we are. Let's,
excellent, well done.
Brush it through there.
Ahead, like a good Boy Scout.
Yeah, so at the end, we'll have 10 minutes of questions for James. And I can't ask them all because there's about 300 odd people here today. And we'll be well into lockdown 5 by the time we finish all those questions. So, and then there'll be a few things at the end. And if you'd like to donate, there'll be an option to donate at the end as well, which will be very much appreciated. So that's enough of me rabbiting on. I'm going to mute myself in a minute and disappear. I'll be back in 45 minutes. But it's my pleasure it really is a pleasure, because I thought I lost you for a moment. But
I wasn't convinced I was coming back, to be honest.
Hand everyone over to James, though, who sat underneath the Aurora Borealis. Where are you, James? Up in Scotland or Scandinavia? Where are you?
Well, I could be anywhere, Michael. I could be anywhere. Who can say?
Broadcasting from a mystery location under the Northern Lights. James, it's over to you. I'll see you, and I'll see you all in about 45 minutes.
Lovely. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Bye.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me for this afternoon's talk on thrushes in winter. So for those of you who haven't met me before, my name's James. I'm a Learning and Engagement Officer with Sussex Wildlife Trust, and I have been since 2018 now. I've always been a very passionate naturalist since childhood, and clearly I have a bizarre fascination for heights as well, but that's probably something we won't go into today. So today we're going to talk about thrushes, and you know, I appreciate that things are very difficult within the current lockdown, and you know, we can't sort of get out and bird watch quite as much as we would like. But I really am very confident that even within the limitations of your daily exercise, you stand a very good chance of both seeing and hearing all of our winter thrushes. Now, I have been very keen in this presentation not to bombard you with sort of endless facts and figures and things that you won't remember. So what I have done is I've tried to make it more about the behaviour and sort of identification and spotting tips that hopefully will help you when you're out in the field. So yeah, let's crack on. Okay, so the word thrush actually comes from Old English for throstle, which was a poetic name for a song thrush. And you know, when we think about thrushes, what do we think of? We typically think of them having a sort of brown back, a spotted breast, and a loud song. Now, that isn't necessarily always the case, but that is the kind of general view that we have. Now, thrushes belong to an order of birds known as the Passeriformes, and this actually includes more than half of all bird species. Now, the passerines, you will also hear them referred to, the Passeriformes, you will hear them referred to as passerines, and these are known as the perching birds, and it's owing to the arrangement of their toes. Now, you could say that, you know, other groups of birds do also perch. For example, the raptors also perch, but they're not known as passerines, and it's due to this kind of anatomical difference in the design of their foot. So the passerines have these 3 toes pointing forwards and the 1 pointing back. Now, all of our thrush species belong to a family known as Turdidae. Their genus is Turdus, and they're known as the true thrushes. So there's about 65 species of true thrushes in the genus Turdus, so it's very, very species rich. But there are 6 species seen regularly in the UK. Now, today we're not going to concentrate on all 6. We're actually just going to look at 5 in more detail. And the reason for that is because the 6 species, it's a breeding summer migrant. And in this part of the country, you're only really going to see this bird on passage migration. Now, this bird is known as the ring ouzel, and you might have to join us for another presentation where we can cover the ring ouzel in a bit more detail. Now, what I would say, the 5 that we're going to look at today, on my morning walk this morning, I actually saw all 5 species that we're now going to go into. So you really do stand a great chance of seeing these, even at the moment within the restrictions. Okay, folks, so of these 5 in Sussex, 3 of them are year-round residents, and then another 2 are winter migrants. Now, of course, in nature, things are never quite that straightforward. And what I mean by that is the 3 that are year-round residents these species still migrate in some parts of their Palearctic range. So therefore, although we think of them as resident, they're not really residents, you know, all over. So it is a little bit more complicated than it sounds. Now, if I was to ask you, what is the UK's commonest thrush species, what would you think it is? If I give you a couple of moments just to ponder that while I have a quick swig of coffee. So what is the UK's commonest thrush? Well, the UK's commonest thrush is, of course, the blackbird, the very, very familiar blackbird. So, of course, this is a species, you know, we're all familiar with without any shadow of a doubt. So the blackbird is a resident species in the UK, but in the eastern parts of its range, so in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, you know, blackbirds tend to be more migratory, and those birds will often move to Western Europe over winter. Now, we have around about 5 million pairs, or a little bit more than 5 million pairs of blackbirds in the UK, but you stand a much higher chance of seeing more blackbirds in winter, and that's because our population is heavily bolstered by birds from the east. In fact, the population of blackbirds is pretty much tripled in winter. Now, where are you going to find a blackbird? Now, this is probably a question I don't really need to answer because it's so familiar to us. But in truth, you're going to find blackbirds absolutely everywhere. You know, this is a bird of parks and gardens and coast and hilly ground and, you know, you name it. But the thing is, you know, the blackbird once was a bird of more remote forest, and it's really only in recent years that it's become more of an urban specialist. Now, as you can see from this map, the blackbird is found pretty much all over the UK, apart from the very highest areas in Scotland. And it's currently a green listed bird, so its conservation status is currently very healthy. Although we have seen sort of small declines in blackbirds in recent years, as a whole, they're not a threatened species. Okay, so we're just going to look at a few sort of a few facts and, well, not facts and figures, but a few bits and pieces about the blackbird, a few identification features. So of course, the male blackbirds, they're very, very distinctive. So in spring and summer, they have these really vibrant yellow-orange beaks and this orange eye ring as well. So you really can't mistake a male blackbird for anything else. Now, in contrast, the female, as you can see in this picture below, she's actually a little bit less, well, a little bit more somber in appearance. So, you know, the females are sort of sooty brown. They have a slightly sort of paler throat and quite a lot of kind of diffuse mottling as well. So they're rather different in appearance to the males. Now, the juveniles actually are very similar to the females, but they tend to have more sort of pale spots on their upper parts. And the thing about the blackbirds, they are quite territorial. So you'll often find one, you know, staking out its territory within your garden. So they're not really a flocking bird, but they will come together during migration. Now, the main thing about the blackbird, of course, as it's become more specialized to urban environments, it's a very versatile, very adaptable bird. So it really is kind of capable of feeding on an awful lot of different food sources, you know, whether that be invertebrates or fruit and berries, or even sort of food that you put out from your kitchen. The blackbirds will pretty much eat all of it. Okay, so a few spotting tips for the blackbird. You know, where and how can you see blackbirds? As if you weren't all seeing them already. Well, the blackbird, of course, is a very confiding bird. So, you know, it's a bird that will often sing from a very, very prominent perch. Often you'll see them, of course, on your roof or on your TV aerial. And the thing to look out for, I would say, is when you disturb a blackbird or when you flush a blackbird, they have a very direct, dashing flight. So often what you'll see is you'll see them flying at very low level, and often they'll combine that with some really kind of noisy flight calls as well. So, you know, look for a bird that darts out of the undergrowth and then darts back in again at the first opportunity. And this probably relates back to their old kind of traditional habits, whereby they've been trying to evade, you know, sort of predators in woodland, you know, predatory birds like sparrowhawk. So this probably is a sort of modern, you know, this is a modern version of that, I suppose. Okay, so the blackbirds, they have this really characteristic habit of drooping their wings and jerking their tail when they're on the ground. You know, this does make them look very alert, and I always think it makes them look quite indignant as well. So it's a really, really kind of defined behavioural characteristic to look out for. So when they are feeding, they tend to hop, or they take these just a few sort of quick steps before they stop, you know, almost as if they're completely frozen. A very, very diagnostic trait of the blackbird. Now, again, also watch for them cocking their heads. So they're listening carefully for sort of sounds, you know, that are coming from the soil, for underground movements. So yeah, look out for this, this cocking head behavior. And of course, the blackbird is a very, very easily agitated bird. You know, they get upset at the merest kind of hint of any kind of disturbance. So listen out for their kind of cacophony of noisy calls, particularly around sunset. Okay, so now we're just going to play a little bit of song and a few calls from the blackbird just to help you identify them. Now, we did have a few sound issues the last time we did this presentation, so I'm really hoping that the sound's going to be a lot better for you all today. Obviously, if there are any issues, then do drop Michael a quick message and we'll see what we can do about it. But fingers crossed it'll be okay. So Blackbird's song, of course, it's one of our prime songsters, one of our favourite songsters. We absolutely love the blackbird. You know, they've got a really kind of rich, really varied repertoire. They're very fluty and melodic. You know, it's a really attractive song because it's kind of played at that sort of key that we really, you know, that we really recognise, that our ears are really attuned to. Now, it's at quite a slow sort of tempo, and generally they'll append this kind of twittering onto the end of each phrase. Now, I'm just going to play a bit of song for you now and really listen out to the very first phrase because you can hear the twittering just at the end, whereas actually this example, unfortunately, most of the phrases don't have much twittering. So listen out. Just there, a little bit of twittering at the end. So you can see there, folks, that it's quite slow tempo. You could see that there were sort of pauses of sort of 3 to 5 seconds between verses. And that's quite diagnostic, especially when I compare it to another species in a couple of species' time. Now, the blackbird, I should say, has a really varied vocabulary of calls, and these can involve chucking or pocking or chacking. There really is a huge variety. As I say, they do get agitated really easily, so lots of these calls will be really familiar to you. And I'm just going to play a couple now. Very familiar calls there, I'm sure, folks. Okay, so the blackbird also has a rather a thin alarm call, very similar to a lot of passerines actually that have quite a similar call to this. And it's quite a fine note and it has quite a lot of sibilance. So it has that kind of rolling S sound in it. Again, it is very fine, so you're going to need to listen really, really carefully for this. I'm just going to play it now. So hopefully you could all hear that there in the background, folks. It is quite a common call, so keep your ears peeled for that type of calls from the undergrowth. Okay, so the blackbird also has a very kind of diagnostic alarm call. There was a little bit of alarm call actually when I played 2 calls ago, but listen out for this crescendo, which is really diagnostic. So you'll often hear that at roost. Okay, folks. So now if I was to ask you what is the UK's most widespread thrush, but that actually has the word thrush in its name, unlike the blackbird, well, I'll give you just a second to think about it. And if you said, is it the song thrush, then you're absolutely correct. It is indeed. So the song thrush is quite a compact bird. It's just very slightly smaller than the blackbird. Although it is a resident species in the UK, it is a migrant in a large part of its Palearctic range in much the same manner as blackbird. So what you tend to find is that birds from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, you know, they tend to be migratory and they're the ones that tend to move into sort of Southern and Western Europe in winter. So we've probably got around about 1.3 million breeding territories. And where will you typically find a song thrush? Well, they are a widespread species. As you can see from the map, you find them pretty much all over the UK, again, just excluding some of those high altitude areas in Scotland. Generally, you'll find them in kind of woodland, farms and parks and gardens. So unlike the blackbird, the song thrush has a red UK conservation status. And this indicates that, you know, there's been a historical decline in its population over the last couple of 100 years, or at least a 50% decline in its breeding numbers or contraction in its breeding range in the last 25 years. So it is very much a threatened species. Now, a few pointers about the song thrush and a few facts and figures. So the song thrush is very much the bird that we think of when we think about a thrush. You know, it has this warm brown back, this kind of buffy yellow sort of chest and throat, and then it has these arrow-shaped spots underneath as well. Now, I would say that unless you're in quite close proximity to the bird, or perhaps looking through binoculars, it can be quite hard to determine that the spots are arrow-shaped, but they certainly are if you get a good enough view, or certainly a lot of them are. Now, the song thrush also has a kind of buff eye ring, and the lower part of its bill, the lower mandible, is also rather kind of buffy yellow in colour. Now, the underwing coverts are rusty buff. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, what on earth are the underwing coverts? Well, the underwing coverts are the armpits. So if you think of the bird with an open wing, then this area just underneath, just where the armpit is, that is basically the underwing coverts. So these can be quite difficult to see in flight. And also, unless the light is particularly good underneath the bird, sometimes it's a difficult thing to see. But if you get a great view, then often you'll see this kind of buffy, rusty yellow colour. Now, the juvenile song thrush, as you can see in the bottom left picture, we've got a juvenile on the bottom left and a fledgling on the bottom right. They're broadly similar, but they're a bit more speckled, somewhat more kind of yellowish, and they've got lots of buff streaks basically on the back, on the mantle and the scapulars. Now, song thrushes generally are quite sort of solitary, and generally outside of the breeding season, you'll almost always sort of see them on their own. Okay, folks, so a few spotting tips about song thrush and things to look out for. Now, with the song thrush, you may well be alerted to the presence of a song thrush through one of its kind of feeding behaviours. And that is basically when it's breaking open snail shells to get at the snail within. So essentially what it will often do is hammer these on the ground or use some kind of anvil to break them open. So that's something to look out for, or to listen out for, I should say. So listen out for that, you know, sort of coming from within the hedgerows or from within the undergrowth. Now, the song thrush is quite a short-tailed, quite a compact bird, and you'll often find that when it's on the ground, it will often flick its wings, which is quite diagnostic. And it's rather a nervous, quite a retiring species. So often you'll find that they're very difficult to get close to. They can be quite nervous and they will take flight relatively quickly, you know, almost as soon as they're aware of your presence. Now, generally, the song thrush will shy away from spending a lot of time in the open. So they're a bird that likes to stay within close proximity of cover for the vast majority of time. Now, one of the key points for song thrush that I would really emphasize this is that when you flush a song thrush, they almost always fly really low and dive straight back into cover. This is really, really diagnostic. Now, they have a very kind of jerky and somewhat erratic flight. So often what you'll see is the top of a sort of mid-brown bird as it quickly sort of disappears straight back into the undergrowth. Now, often that's combined with a little call as well, which I'm going to play for you on the next page. Now, the last thing that I would say is that, you know, they tend to sing quite actively from around about November onwards, as they start actively sort of defending, you know, kind of hard-won territories. So listen out for their bouts of song from November onwards. Okay, folks, and what is the song that you're going to be listening for? Well, song thrush song it's really loud, and to be honest with you, it's more like proclamation than singing. It has a lot of variation. You know, sometimes it might be really squeaky, sometimes it can be really shrill. You know, it really does change. You know, it doesn't tend to pause very often, but the one feature that I would point out to you that you really need to listen for is the repetition. So the song thrush is a really repetitive singer. So listen out for these verses as they're repeated between 2 to 4 times. So repeat it 3 times there. Repeat it 3 times again. Repeat it 2 times. So lots and lots of repetition, folks. 3 times. So I'm sure you get the picture. So repetition really is key for song thrush song. Now, in great contrast to song thrush song is the song thrush call. Now, the song thrush call is it's very discreet, folks. Okay, it's really, really discreet. So it's not as kind of hard and ticking and elasticated as a robin's call. And what you will find is they often utter this call before they take to flight, sometimes during flight, and also when they land as well. Now, I can promise you that if you can get your ear in on this discreet call, you will see an awful lot more song thrushes, and you'll realise the abundance of song thrushes, you know, when you're out on your walks. But it is very, very subtle. It's just a very, very brief zit. So listen out for it here, folks. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're sitting there thinking, how on earth are we going to pick up on that call because it's barely even noticeable? And in some ways, you're absolutely right. But this is a call. The more you practice with this call, then the more attuned you become to it. And the great thing with song thrush is that generally when this call is uttered, you'll often see the bird take to flight very soon after. And because of that, it's quite easy to put those two things together and realize that it was a song thrush. Okay, so what about song thrush alarm call? Well, song thrush alarm call is very different from the standard sort of the standard call. And the alarm call, it's much sharper and higher pitched. It's like a series of kind of electrical scolding sounds. So I'm just going to play it now. It's quite squeaky as well. It's definitely got a squeaky element to it. So listen out for that. Okay, everybody. So what is our other resident thrush species? Well, actually, I did touch on it during one of the song thrush slides. And our other resident thrush species is, of course, the mistle thrush. So the mistle thrush is a very large bird, actually, 27 centimeters. So quite incredibly, a large mistle thrush may be very slightly smaller than a male sparrowhawk, which is quite an amazing statistic, I always think. So we've probably got around about 170,000 breeding territories for the mistle thrush in the UK. So therefore, we only have around 10% as many mistle thrushes as we do song thrushes. Now, the mistle thrush is once again also a migrant in the sort of northern parts of its range. And it's also a rather nomadic bird. So it moves around in response to sort of food availability within the UK. Now, where are you likely to see a mistle thrush? Well, mistle thrushes tend to prefer sort of feeding out in the open. So you'll see them in kind of open woodland, in larger gardens and sort of scrubby areas. And this is quite different, actually, compared to where you might see them in southern Europe, when you often find them quite high up on the mountains, within the tree line. Now, the mistle thrush, like the song thrush, also has a red conservation status. So it is also a threatened species, unfortunately. Now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the mistle thrush. So the mistle thrush, I would say, is probably more familiar by name than through being observed regularly. I would say that a lot of people know about the mistle thrush, but they probably don't see them very often. Now, the mistle thrush is a much larger, paler bird than the song thrush. It doesn't really have that mid-brown back. It tends to be a more sort of grey-brown. It's much colder. Now, if you look at the face of a mistle thrush, particularly this bird on the top, as an example, you can see it has this rather kind of complex patterning. So it's got, sort of combinations of sort of patchy light and dark, which is really, really distinctive on this bird. It also tends to have more variegation on the wings as well than the song thrush. Now, the mistle thrush, the spots on its belly tend to be a bit more bolder and they tend to be more rounded than they are on the song thrush. So the song thrush, of course, has those arrow-shaped spots, but the mistle thrush has spots that extend all the way down to the bottom of the belly and right the way along the flanks on the side of the bird. So they look more heavily spotted. Now, the mistle thrush has white underwing coverts. So again, it has white armpits. So you might be lucky enough to see that in flight if the light is very good. Now, although this can be a tricky thing to see, if a bird does happen to take off in front of you, you might notice that it's actually got these whitish edges to the outer tail feathers. Sometimes this can be noticeable if you're close enough. Now, until they've molted, you'll tend to find that juveniles are very pale and they have an awful lot of sort of flecking and streaking and spotting, particularly on the upper parts. So if you look at this bird in the bottom right, this is a juvenile mistle thrush, and you can really see evidence of all the kind of lighter coloration on the back and the closed wings. Now, the mistle thrush is a very, very territorial bird. It really will vigorously defend any food supply, particularly berries in the autumn. So something to look out for. Okay, a few spotting tips for the mistle thrush, folks. Well, what should you look out for? Well, the mistle thrush as a whole, it is a more confident bird than the song thrush. So you will tend to find them feeding out in the open as opposed to feeding quite close to cover like the song thrush. Now, I should say that it is a bolder bird as a whole, and it tends to stand a lot more upright. And because of that, it looks sort of longer necked. It looks a lot more alert. So you'll tend to find, if you think of these kind of bold, upright standing mistle thrushes compared to these kind of hunched, laterally compressed song thrushes, you know, there's quite a difference in their stance. Now, as I said, the mistle thrush is very territorial and sometimes can be really aggressive. And actually, mistle thrushes are known to have both sort of inflicted injury and even killed other bird species, you know, potentially during these kind of full frontal attacks, you know, if they're under threat from other bird species. So they really are a very aggressive species. And of course, they're quite large as well. So, you know, they're very long-winged, long-tailed, and they're quite powerful flyers. Now, the flight of the mistle thrush is really, really distinctive. So what you'll tend to find is they tuck their wings in between flaps, and it leads to having a very, very undulating flight. So if you think of a mistle thrush, they have almost a flight that's like a sound wave. You know, it has this distinct sort of peaks and troughs. If anything, I would say that the mistle thrush flight reminds me of that of a great spotted woodpecker. They definitely have the same kind of dips in the flight. So something to look out for. Now, mistle thrush, you will find they tend to quickly sort of gain height upon takeoff. Now, if you think back to the song thrush, you might remember that I said when a song thrush is flushed, it usually dives straight back into cover very, very quickly. Well, the mistle thrush, of course, doesn't do that. It tends to gain height and fly sort of further into the distance. So something to look out for. Now, it's a more social bird, so sometimes you tend to see them in pairs and groups, particularly outside of the breeding season, certainly more so than song thrush. And one of the things that may well alert you to the presence of mistle thrush is to listen out for their really kind of rattling, chattering calls that often you'll hear uttered by small groups within the tree canopy. So something to look out for, or something to listen out for, I should say. So when it comes to mistle thrush song, you know, look out for these birds singing from a really exposed perch, often in really stormy weather. And in fact, this actually gives the bird one of its colloquial names, which is the stormcock, for that very reason. Now, if you hear a mistle thrush song, then what does it sound like? Or I should say, if you hear a mistle thrush sing its song, what does it sound like? Well, the mistle thrush song is actually much more like Blackbird than it is song thrush. So it doesn't have the repetition of song thrush. But what it does have is it has these fairly short verses, but they never have these kind of squeaky endings to each of the verses. So it sounds faster with shorter pauses, and it sounds more kind of desolate. It's got a very rapid tone. It sounds like a blackbird in a real rush, you know? So have a listen to this. Very distinctive, much faster than Blackbird, much faster. And you know, the pauses are very, very brief. Now, the calls, however, are super distinctive, and these may well be what draws your attention to nearby mistle thrush. So you want to listen out for these really dry rattles and this kind of scolding, rattling call, the alarm call. Now, what I would say is if you imagine like an old wooden football rattle, these calls are really, really similar. And once you're tuned into this, you'll hear this from a mile off. Really like a football rattle, that. Really, really similar. Okay, everybody. So now we're going to move on to probably what is our most numerous migrant thrush, which is, I'll give you just a second to ponder that. It is the very beautiful redwing. Stunning bird, absolutely stunning bird. So the redwing, it's a winter migrant species to the UK. So it's very much a nomadic species. This is a bird that you'll find pardon me, you'll find breeding in the boreal sort of taiga forests, you know, in northern latitudes. So, you know, we only have a handful of breeding pairs in the UK, probably just in northern Scotland. It's a very, very rare breeder. So, you know, what is the wintering population of redwings? Well, it's really, really hard to quantify. And part of the reason for that is because they are very eruptive. You know, they respond to you know, to food, to the quantity of food, basically. So their eruptive sort of nomadic nature means it's quite hard to estimate. So we think there's probably around about 1 million redwing in the UK each year. Now they generally arrive from sort of September, October time, and they'll tend to leave again in early spring. Now, where will you see redwings? Well, in winter, you'll see redwings generally along kind of woodland edges, along hedgerows, and in fields, parks, and gardens. Very, very different to their sort of breeding habitat in the boreal forest. Now, as you can see from this map, the redwings are quite well distributed across the whole of the UK, and they are also, again, a red listed bird in the UK. Now, the one thing I would say is because we have such a small breeding population, and of course we have lost most of the breeding population as well, they are red listed. But actually what is perhaps more important is to look at protecting the sort of the wintering feeding areas. You know, that is perhaps more important than actually looking out for the breeding population of redwing, because it is very, very small. So looking after those feeding areas is absolutely pivotal. Okay, so a few things about the redwing, or a bit about redwing migration, in fact. So as I mentioned, redwings are really, really nomadic. So you will find that some redwings, you know, will go completely different directions in different years, you know, migrating to new kind of winter locations, depending on the availability of food. Now, they actually migrate by night, and what they will do when they arrive is they'll gorge themselves on all the kind of fruits and berries that are available in autumn. And then when that has been expended, they'll move into more open areas in search of invertebrates. Now you can see here that the redwings are quite well distributed across most of the UK, or certainly across England and Ireland, and you do tend to find that central England really sees the majority of the redwings. They're a bit sparser the further you go north. So numbers really do vary enormously as well each year. You know, they respond you know, to how much food is available. Okay, so a little bit about the redwing. So the redwing is a really, really small, compact bird. In fact, it's only starling size, so much, much smaller than the mistle thrush. It's really compact, really, really short-tailed. Now, in similarity to the song thrush, it also has these fairly warm brown upper parts, not dissimilar in that respect. And it has these very, very bold facial patterning. So it's really very, very distinctive. So if you look at the redwing's face, you'll see it's got this really lovely pale stripe above the eye. So this is known as the supercilium. So that's a key thing to look out for on the redwing. Now, if you look just below its cheek, you will also see that it's got another pale stripe, which is known as the submustachial stripe. Now, just above that, you would have the mustachial stripe. And just below that, you would have the lateral throat stripe. But you don't have to worry about that on this occasion, because it's that submustachial stripe that's really, really distinctive. Now, the redwing, of course, is named after its particularly rusty red flanks and underwing coverts, the armpits. Now, of course, those underwing coverts may be very difficult to see in flight, particularly if the light's quite poor as well. Now, if you look at the beak, you'll see that the lower mandible, of course, is also distinctly yellow. So that's quite a nice identification tip. Now, let's just look at some spotting tips for redwing. Okay, well, the one key thing that I would tell you, everybody, is that the redwing is easily the most skittish of all of our thrush species. So you will tend to find, you know, dependent on the flock in question, they can be really hard to approach. And in fact, they won't let you anywhere near them, particularly if they're feeding quite low down within the hedgerows. Generally, if they are birds that are feeding higher up in the canopy, then sometimes they will allow a slightly closer approach, but they are skittish. Now, generally, they're a very social species. So where you find one redwing, you tend to find a lot of redwing. You know, you will find them feeding together. And you'll find when they're flying, they sort of partially close their wings between flaps. And even though they do that, the flight is still rather direct. So it totally lacks the sort of undulations that you would see in mistle thrush. While they tend to wheel about and fly in sort of large, loose circles, you will find that flight is quite direct. Now, when you do disturb redwings, you'll find that usually the entire party, the entire flock will take to flight. Now, often they'll either fly high and disappear into the distance, or they'll fly high and land in distant treetops. And that's usually pretty common behavior. Now, one thing to listen out for is this really distinctive flight call. It's a very high-pitched, very drawn-out flight call. And this is something that you will even hear on migration at night. So, for example, if you happen to go outside in, say, October, or also when the redwings are leaving the UK, usually around about March, April time, you will hear this flight call. Even if you live in an urban area, I urge you to get outside at this time of the year and listen out for it, because it is really distinctive, especially when there's very little other ambient noise. Now, with the redwing, one of the key tips that I can give you is to really keep your eyes and ears sort of tuned for birds moving quickly along hedgerows. Now, you will find, particularly if they are feeding low down, they'll tend to move on very quickly when you approach. And what you may see is just sight of birds just disappearing from the back of the hedgerow. You never really get a very good look, so they can be really evasive. Okay, so redwing are often seen foraging on the ground together, and this is particularly kind of later on in the winter. So what you will find is that once they've expended all the berries and the fruits, this is when they tend to start feeding more prolifically on the ground. Because they are quite a small bird, sometimes they do blend into the vegetation really well. So you really will need to have a good look. Now, often you'll find that when flocks actually stop on migration stopovers, they can be quite sort of vocal. So again, it's worth listening out for this sort of squeaky cacophony, amongst communal roosts. Okay, folks, so now we're just going to have a little listen to Redwing. Now, what I would say is I'm only going to play you a very, very brief snippet of song. The main reason for that is we very rarely hear Redwing song because, of course, they don't really breed in the UK. So it's really quite variable anyhow, but I'm just going to play you a little bit just to give you a snippet. So lots of squeaky twittering, that's quite diagnostic for redwing song. But what you really need to listen out for is the very, very characteristic flight calls. Okay, so if you go outside, as I say, at the right time of year, at night when they're migrating, you're very, very likely to hear this no matter where you live. But it's also the call to listen out for amongst the sort of hedgerows and woodland edges. So I'm going to play this for you now, everybody. Okay, so hopefully you all heard that. So it was a very thin, high-pitched seep note. Okay, so that's what to listen out for. Now, often you'll find that when redwings are feeding, you want to listen out for that call, but one other call as well, which is a slightly more nasal note. Now, this is just a very, very brief snippet, so listen carefully. But first of all, you're going to hear this more nasal gack note, and then you'll hear the seep. So I'm just going to play this for you now, everybody. So hopefully you heard that. It was a very soft note, first of all, and that's quite distinctive. And actually, it's that note that often draws me to redwing presence within the hedgerows. Now, what I would say, folks, just before we move on, at the end of this presentation, we will also be putting some links to take you somewhere where you can listen to all of these bird calls again, because it's well worth familiarising yourself with some of these to make it a little bit easier to pick up these thrushes in winter. Okay, so the redwing alarm call is actually quite similar to the song thrush alarm call. So I'm just going to play this for you quite quickly. Where it's that sort of electrical scolding. You tend not to hear that you don't tend to hear this too often. But as I say, it's not dissimilar to the song thrush. Okay, so we're going to move on to our final winter thrush species now, folks, which is another migrant species. And it is the very, very handsome Fieldfare. Just a beautiful thrush, this one really is stunning. So it's another migrant species, so of course another winter visitor to Western and Southern Europe. Now, like the redwing, this is a very, very nomadic species. It's a really rare breeder in the UK. Again, we probably don't have more than a handful of breeding birds here overall. Now, the wintering population, in much the same way as per redwing, you know, we may have 750,000 birds, perhaps even more here over winter. Again, it's very, very difficult to determine because of that eruptive nature. As with the redwing, they also tend to arrive from around about October time. The numbers will build throughout the winter, and then they tend to leave sort of early to mid-spring. So where are you likely to see fieldfare? Well, in truth, pretty much the same kind of habitats as redwing. So you'll find them along hedgerows, you know, in open fields, parks and gardens, but also you tend to see them more perhaps in kind of grassy and arable areas than you do redwing as a whole. Now, the fieldfare, once again, is another red-listed thrush species, but as per redwing, you know, it's perhaps again more important to look after these vital winter feeding areas, which have much more impact on our total fieldfare population than just the breeding population. Okay, everybody, so a little bit about fieldfare migration. Well, hundreds of thousands of fieldfares might cross the North Sea to come to Britain each year. Now, once again, you know, these movements are very much determined by the availability of food, and that means there can be a lot of sort of variation year upon year. Now, you will find that this is a bird that really likes kind of feasting on fruit, particularly late in the winter. So you will find that birds often will return to the same orchards year upon year, but others might go somewhere completely different. So again, that's very, very similar to the redwing. Now, the fieldfare is pretty widely distributed across the UK. You won't tend to find them so much in urban areas, but having said that, you do tend to see them in larger parks, so do bear that in mind. Now, often they'll feed in kind of open farmland, but you want to be looking amongst those hedgerows as per redwing to try and find them. And later on in the winter, they tend to move into the gardens to feast on the fruit when, of course, the berry haul has been largely expended. So here's just a little map just to show kind of orchard distribution across the UK and how that relates to fieldfare distribution as a whole. And you can see actually there's definitely a tie-in between the two maps. You can really see, you know, that some of the larger fieldfare populations are really centered where those orchards are. Now, of course, if you happen to have an orchard quite close to you, then you might be lucky enough to see, you know, huge flocks of fieldfares descending into them during winter. And actually, recently, I have to say, there really have been, certainly where I am, some really fantastic fieldfare flocks. And I actually saw a flock of 120 plus fieldfare, just a single flock just a few days ago. So it's a great time to see them out on your daily exercise. So let's talk a little bit more about the fieldfare. Well, the fieldfare is a really handsome bird. It's a large bird. It's very heavily built, long wings, long tail, just very slightly smaller than the Mistle Thrush. Now, in flight, it has some really diagnostic features. So if you look at this bird down here on the right, you can see it's got a really dark tail. Great thing to look out for. It's got a grey rump, so that's just in front of the tail. And those features really do help to kind of differentiate it from Mistle Thrush in flight. Now, the fieldfare has this lovely sort of red-brown back. It's got a grey crown and a grey nape as well, the back of the neck. So it is rather spotted below, and the breast as well is quite rusty in coloration. It's very distinctive bird. So the armpits once again are white, which is the same as the Mistle Thrush. And it has a rather different beak. So the fieldfare beak is actually bright yellow, just with a dark tip. Whereas, for example, the redwing just had that yellow lower mandible. Now, the fieldfare is yet again another territorial bird in much the same manner as the Mistle Thrush, and actually they will even actively pursue corvids or crow species and bombard them with excrement, which must be an amazing thing to see, but not so good if you're a crow, clearly. Now, as I mentioned, the fieldfare, very, very territorial bird, so you may well see a fieldfare really kind of vigorously defending a winter food source against any potential rivals. And this may even happen in your garden. A few years ago, I had a very territorial fieldfare in the crabapple at the bottom of the garden, and it would not let another bird into that crabapple for love nor money. Okay, so a few spotting tips for fieldfare, folks. Well, the fieldfare, like the redwing, is a very social species. It tends always to be found in these kind of small, noisy flocks that feed together. So very, very similar in that manner. Now, it has rather flappy wing beats, and it tends to have these little gliding pauses as well. Now, the interesting thing about that is it doesn't actually result in very much undulation in the flight. So whereas for the Mistle Thrush is really undulating, but the fieldfare still has a rather direct flight. Now, you may well be drawn to the fieldfare or drawn to flocks of fieldfare by their sort of camera shutter-like calls. So these are really, really obvious, and I'm going to play some of these on the next page for you. Now, as per Redwing, one of the biggest hints I can give you is to keep your ears and eyes tuned for birds moving quickly along the hedgerows. Now, if you're really careful, you can actually sneak up on them when they're feeding in the hedgerows and get some pretty good views, but you really will need to be quite quiet and quite subtle. Now, the Fieldfare, like the Mistle Thrush, it has a rather kind of bold sort of standing up posture when it's feeding on the ground. And also very similar to Blackbird, so they tend to sort of take these short hops and then also pause when they're feeding as well. So they have both kind of characteristics of Mistle Thrush and Blackbird when they're feeding on the ground. Now, later on, in particular in winter, you will often see them feeding in the kind of open fields and open grassy areas, often amongst other thrush species. That may well be amongst Mistle Thrush, may well be amongst Redwing. So don't think that one flock of birds in a field is all going to be the same. You may well get a great mixture of quite a few of the different thrush species. Now, as I say, listen out for this noisy chattering that you often will hear amongst kind of hedgerows and within woodland edges, particularly around dusk. And these are kind of communal roosts of fieldfares. Okay, everybody, so what should you listen out for when it comes to the fieldfare? Well, again, we don't often hear fieldfare song in the UK, and that, of course, is just because we don't really have a breeding population as such. So I'm just going to play it to you very, very briefly, but fieldfare song really is just a combination of the calls with a little bit more chatter. So there you go, a bit of fieldfare song for you, everybody, but don't worry about remembering that too much. Now, what you want to listen out for is the calls. Now, on migration, often they have this kind of squeaky, quivering note, which is often interspersed with the more kind of characteristic camera shutter clicks. So listen out for both of those in this clipping. There's the camera shutter, and this is the squeaky quivering. More camera shutter. There we go, folks. And also you will find, you know, if they're pursuing other birds, like crows, for example, they will give an even more furious chatter. And you'll hear again some of the camera shutter like clicks in this too. This one's a bit more sort of furious. There we go, you get the idea. So listen out for the camera shutter, really, really diagnostic on the fieldfare. Okay, folks, so just to make sure you've all been listening, we're going to have a little exam now. No, I'm just kidding. There's no exam. Don't worry, it's not an exam. What I'm going to do is just show you a few quick pictures just to make sure you've all taken away some of the main identification tips. Okay, so if I was to show you this bird, and we said it's a sooty brown bird, with a fairly sort of pale throat and upper breast and lots of diffuse mottling, you would all tell me that this bird is it's a female blackbird. It's a female blackbird, okay? So again, a much more subtle bird in sort of coloration and patterning than the male, but in her own way, very, very distinctive. Now, what about if I was to show you this one? So this one's a bit of a curveball, really. What you can say is that it's got a very bright orange-yellow beak, and also a very prominent orange eye ring. So actually that would tell you that this is a male blackbird. Now you might all be thinking that this is an albino blackbird, but it's actually what's known as a leucistic blackbird. Now I would say that the blackbird does seem to be a species that is particularly susceptible to leucism. In fact, I had a female blackbird in my garden for 7 years who was partially leucistic, so she still had some darker feathers amongst the white. Now, leucism is quite different to albinism because leucism actually is a partial loss of pigment, but it's a reduction in multiple pigments as opposed to just melanin. So albinism is just a loss of melanin. Okay, folks, so next one. So this bird, it's quite stocky, short-tailed, arrow-shaped spots, sort of buffy yellow on the sort of upper breast and the flanks, a pale buffish lower mandible on the beak. So that would tell you that this bird is a It's a song thrush, absolutely. For those of you who got that right, well done. Now the next bird, it's paler in appearance, greyer in look, spots that extend all the way down to the bottom of the belly, all the way along the flanks, long-winged, long-tailed, white armpits. So that would tell you that this bird is a mistle thrush. And of course with the patterning on the face as well, very, very distinctive. Okay, folks, next one. So, oh, sorry, I've just given that away. There you go, it's a Fieldfare. It's a Fieldfare. Apologies, everybody, I didn't give you a chance there, did I? So, yes, it's basically got a dark tip to the tail, a grey rump, a rusty breast, rusty upper breast, and fairly light underwing coverts. That tells you it's a Fieldfare. This one here, very prominent. So you've got a very prominent pale supercilium above the eye, a pale submustachial stripe, a little bit of evidence of rusty red flanks, and that will tell you that this bird is, of course, a redwing. So just the last two, everybody. A really easy one here for you. You really can't fail to get this one right. Of course, rusty red underwing coverts, wings that are partially tucked in between flaps, of course, tells you that this is a flock of redwing. And the last one, again, long-winged, long-tailed, dark tail tip, rusty breast, grey rump, tells you that this bird is a Fieldfare. Okay, folks, so that's it for the test. So the very last thing we're going to look at very quickly is we're just going to talk about, some of the threats to our thrushes. The reason being, of course, I mentioned that 4 of our 5 species, or 4 of our 5 kind of winter species, are red-listed birds, which of course means that they're threatened species. Now, we do know that kind of mortality amongst thrush species is quite high, but there's no one single reason for this. The simple fact is there's a number of combining reasons as to why that we're seeing declines in their populations. Now, of course, as in line with a lot of our other birds, farmland birds have really suffered through intensive agriculture. And in fact, song thrush numbers have declined by more than 50% in the last sort of 50 odd years, and mistle thrushes by more than 40%. Now, the kind of degradation of habitat has had a real sort of impact, so where hedgerows have been removed, where ditches have been removed, where we've lost rough grassland, we've lost all these areas that are, pivotal areas for both feeding and nesting. Now, of course, as we've drained a lot of land for agriculture, and, the tillage of land, of course, has reduced the numbers of the invertebrates that they need to be able to feed. Now, of course, they're not the only reasons, and kind of within agricultural areas, the use of pesticides, of course, has had a huge impact on invertebrates and insects as a whole. Of course, this is not news, we all know this. Unfortunately for the thrushes, molluscicides in particular have had a real impact on, prey items such as slugs, snails and worms, which they rely on for feeding. Now, interestingly, in woodland as well, woodland has also, been a problem because the drainage of sort of ground in woodland and the loss of the shrub layer through both canopy closure and through browsing has had a huge impact. Now, interestingly, deer actually really have a big part to play in this. And part of the reason for that is, 4 of our 6 deer species are not native. And unfortunately, they have an awful propensity for over browsing that scrub layer, which many of our birds rely on for nesting. So in fact, they've had a real impact, not on just thrush numbers, but on many of our sort of songbirds, passerines, which are struggling in those environments. And of course, we no longer have any natural predators for deer species either. Now, the only other thing I would mention is that perhaps, nest raiding as well, doesn't help. Clearly, cats and foxes and predatory birds, they all take their toll, particularly on young thrushes too. Now, this factor on its own, of course, isn't solely responsible. It's a combination of all these things, which play their part. So moving on to something slightly more positive, the very last thing I would say is, it is so important. It's perhaps more important than ever, that we really protect both the kind of breeding areas for our resident thrushes, but also the winter feeding areas for those that arrive here in winter, the redwings and the fieldfares. Now, we are constantly making improvements and changes to both kind of woodland and hedgerow management. And, these ongoing changes are pivotal in making sure that we protect these habitats, to enable the kind of increasing numbers of all our beautiful thrush species. And with that, folks, that's absolutely all for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. And what I would say is all that is left now is for you all to get out on your daily exercise, keep looking at those hedgerows, and see if you can find all 5 of the thrush species that I've talked about today. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, James. That was great. Thank you very much for that. If you do that, I'll do this, and then here we are.
Hopefully the sound was okay for everybody today. I think it
was. My screen was a bit sort of hazy. I don't know. I got a feeling it could be my computer on the blink though. So could well have been me. Yeah. So thank you for that, James. That was great. We had loads of questions. All now you answered some of these as you went along. So I can take some out now. We have time for a few, so I'll just go through a few which weren't picked up on. Jeanette says, according to the Beatles, blackbirds sing in the dead of night. So why do blackbirds sing at night? Any idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it's not only blackbirds, and you'll hear this from robins extensively as well. And the likely reason for this is increasing levels of light pollution. Now, of course, as our society has become more urbanized, we're producing so much light at night that actually what it's doing is it's changing the behavior of these birds. And actually what it's doing is it's meaning that they sing for vastly more extended periods of time than they traditionally would. Whereas, of course, in rural areas where it is pitch black, at night, it's very likely that these birds won't be anywhere near as active. So actually, it's very much human impact that is to blame essentially for these birds singing at night. So it's a behavioural change.
Okay, now there's quite a few people were asking Martin, Daryl, Joe, Rona, really about how we can help thrushes in our gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, of course, I touched on the mollusca size, didn't I, at the end of the presentation? And what I would say is that the only mollusca side that anybody should have in their garden is a thrush. That ultimately is key. And unfortunately, the use of sort of pesticides and insecticides as a whole has been hugely detrimental. But it's just sort of it's leaving things a little bit untidy. It's doing less essentially. You'll do more by doing less. And just leaving areas where birds are able to feed, providing them the right kind of vegetative cover, for both kind of keeping hidden and suitable kind of breeding as well. Planting of fruiting trees that will really benefit these birds in autumn and winter. All of these things, will add up to making key differences. So those are the sort of things I would concentrate on.
Brilliant. I mean, we got a little hedge at the bottom there, which is great. With the blackbird nests in there, but also the song thrush feeds at the bottom.
Yeah.
And we just planted a rowan tree this year, but we got some ivy, which I was very thrilled in the week because I saw a redwing actually sat in the ivy over there. Don't see him in the garden too much, but that was brilliant. So I was so pleased. I actually got a little picture which I've put on the on the webpage later on. It's not a good thing. Don't get excited, folks. It's not a good thing. But, and finally, just another ID question from Christine here is if she sees a distant flock of thrushes, okay. Yeah. What's the real sort of tips to tell them apart from Fieldfare and Redwing?
Yeah, if they're really distant, that is going to make things slightly more difficult. But what I would say is probably try and concentrate on the length of the tail. So the Redwing is really compact, and because of its compactness, it doesn't seem to have that sort of tail extension that the Fieldfare does. And I find that even when you see them at a distance, it is really the shape of the bird that is quite distinctive. They do tend to be quite similar in flight. Like neither species has that sort of, has the undulating flight like Mistle Thrush does. But yeah, I would probably concentrate on the sort of tail length as being the key. If there's any kind of reasonable light and you can see any kind of color, then that should kind of help to determine. But, perhaps another thing I would say is they do tend to fly in mixed flocks. Don't think that necessarily it's just going to be a flock of Redwing or it's just going to be a flock of Fieldfare. You will often find, if you look carefully at a flock, you'll pick out both birds within the flock, and that's the truth of the matter. So perhaps that makes things more difficult. I'm not sure.
Well, thank you again.